Welcome, and we're about to go into the Exodus narrative, the very first Parsha, and hopefully you can hear it right now. So yesterday, as you remembered, I was having some difficulties with the Rashi,
Do we
right?
need to do the prayer?
Yes, we do. Thank you for reminding me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need a sergeant at arms, clearly. Okay, thank you. So there were a few problems that I had with this Rashi, so I wanted to go over it, and I did do some of the research, and I will tell you that I solved some of the problems, but didn't solve all of them. So here we go. First of all, Rashi says, the signs that I put, God says to Moses, the signs that I put in your hand. And Rashi says, Lo al shlosha otota amorot lamala. He says, this isn't a reference where God is telling Moses, these signs that I've put in your hands is not referring to the three signs that God gave Moses before. And I could think of the two of them, but I couldn't think of the three of them. They are, in fact, three signs. One was the rod turning into the snake. Okay, we got that one. When his hand became leprous when he put it into his bosom, that was the second one. We got that. But the one I forgot was that when he poured water from the Nile on the ground, it became blood. That was the third sign. All right. So those that we at least we solved that particular issue. Now, what's interesting is he says, I'm not referring, Rashi says that these signs that he's talking about, we'll go on with the Rashi, right? Sha'arei lo lifnei parot tziva la'asotam. He didn't command him to do them before Pharaoh, right? Ela lifnei Yisrael. But he commanded Moses to do these particular, in other words, referring to these three signs, to do them before the Israelites. Shia aminu lo, so that they would believe him, that God tells Moses to do these things earlier on, before the Israelites, because Moses questions whether the Israelites in fact will believe him. Okay, so Moses tells him to show. According to Rashi, God tells Moses to produce these signs in front of the Israelites so that they would believe him. Velo matzinu, and this is the part that gives me trouble, okay? Velo matzinu, and we don't find she'asa'am lifanav, that he did them before him, the him referring to Pharaoh, that he did these three things before Pharaoh. Ela moftim she'ani, so he says, but rather these moftim that God is talking about now to Moses, she'ani atid lasum biyadecha b'Mitzrayim, I am going to give these, put them into your control in Egypt. Kamor, and then he goes, Ki yedaber elechem paro, when Pharaoh says to him, to you, etc., which is going to come up soon enough, right? And I did check out chapter 7, and again, it's Pharaoh is not saying he doesn't believe him, etc., and that um, so I think he's saying, that's where I believe he tells him that the plagues are going to happen, so that these muftim possibly are referring to the 10 plagues. Va'al tidma, and do not be surprised, etc. It says, Asher something that I have placed in your hands, shekain mashma'o keshitadaber imor. But because what it's referring to is when you speak to him. Kfar samtim biyadecha, I already have placed them in your hands. So, quite honestly, I find this a little bit confusing. I find this confusing because he's saying early, Rashi's saying that he's not to do them before Pharaoh. Does he mean, as I'm sort of going over this and going over this and going over this, is he referring then to the 10 plagues, which you've heard me explain this as referring to, or is he actually, well, he must be referring to the 10 plagues because Rashi explicitly says that they're not the three plagues, that the three signs, excuse me, that were mentioned earlier on, right? So, and that in fact he does do them before the Israelites. But then on the other hand, we know that when he comes and talks to Pharaoh, one of the things he does is he throws his rod on the ground and it becomes a serpent, and Pharaoh's sorcerers do the same thing, and Moses's serpent eats up the other serpents, or according to rabbinic tradition, his rod actually consumes the other rods. Okay, he does that. We know that. There's no mention of the hand in the bosom thing turning leprous. That we're not aware of. And but there's also, of course, the Nile turning to blood. But I don't believe that that third plague, no, excuse me, that third sign is mentioned. But the first one is, and that's what confuses me. So either we understand Rashi to mean all three, and in fact, Moses didn't do all three in front of Pharaoh, and we leave it as referring to the three that he showed the Israelites to so that they'd believe him. And that certainly is supported by the text. And that, in fact, when God is talking to Moses now, he's referring to the 10 plagues. And that's about as good as I can get it. And if you have a question of me now, or if you need any further clarification from me, because I've been talking a lot and quickly, please feel free to ask me. But if you were able to follow my argument and my logic, that's great. Any Should I pause a second so you can ask a question? Okay, gonna take that as a no. All right. So that's trying to sort out the stuff that I wasn't able to figure out yesterday. So now we can go on. Va'amarta el Pharaoh, you shall say to Pharaoh, Ko Amar Hashem, thus saith the Lord, right? B'ni bechori Yisrael, my firstborn sons or children are the Israelites. The Israelites are my firstborn sons. Interesting statement as such. In other words, again, trying to look at this from a literary point of view, and I think we could understand it as a reference, a sort of an allusion in a way to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because at least according to this narrative, of course, the very first person, the very first Jew, we believe was Abraham. And the reason why we believe he's the very first Jew, let's say as opposed to Noah, right, has something to do with the fact that he was tested, right, in a way that everyone who preceded him wasn't tested. Abraham goes through all these tests, including the very last one, of course, which is the Akedah. And the other piece is that Abraham tried to introduce people to the idea of one transcendent creator. Noah may have believed in God, but he didn't do anything to try and promote that idea. Now, we know, most of us, I think, know that it's not for us to go out and actively try and convert people. In fact, there was a time when back in rabbinic times when the whole group, this was a group called the Idumeans, were forcibly converted at the time, and there were terrible consequences as a result of that. But rather, Moses talks to the Israelites in the book of Deuteronomy. He says to the Israelites, if you follow the divine law, if you follow the Torah, if you are faithful to God, other nations will admire you. They will see how you live, and they will want to follow in your path. And that is the way in which, so in other words, to be living examples of what it is to be faithful people. At any rate, I'm trying to deconstruct this idea of what does it mean to say that we are God's firstborn, right? That's the idea. Okay, Rashi has something to say about this down here. For Amarta el Paro, you shall say to Pharaoh, Keshetishma shelibo chazak, when you hear that his heart is strong, vayima'en, and he will refuse lishloach, to send you, emor lochein, say this to him. B'ni bechori. So what do we mean by this? Lashon gedula. So he says this has the connotation of preeminence. Come on, and there's an example, right? In this is Psalm 89. Af ani bechor etnehu. I, I myself will make him preeminent. Zehu pshuto. This is its straightforward, literal meaning. Umidrasho, and more interpretive and perhaps metaphorical meaning, kan, is Chatam HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, sealed al Mechirat HaBachorah, on this the sale of the firstborn, Shelakach Yaakov Me'esav, which Jacob took from Esau. So it's interesting, right? This is actually a profound and beautiful interpretation here. That when God Himself says, Israel is my firstborn, well, we know Israel is another term for Jacob, right? And here and what it's also suggesting that is up to this point, there's a certain nagging problem with Jacob buying the birthright from Esau for a bowl of pottage. Excuse me one moment. In the sense that there's a need for God to be able to seal that, to say, yes, that is in fact the right thing. You'd have to go back to that passage. We had the lesson about that with Rashi, about that, what that sale meant, and the fact that Esau was willing to give up his birthright for a bowl of pottage, for a bowl of lentil soup. And there's sort of a overall thought as to how people see spiritual gifts as opposed to material gifts. So that's at least the headline of that. Going on. Va'omar elecha, and I shall say to you, Shalach et b'ni vayavdeni. So this is this famous statement, right? So this is, remember, Moses is quoting God in this particular case. He's quoting God as saying, but Israel is my firstborn, and I say to you, this is God through Moses, say to you, send my people, right? Free my people so that they may serve me. And you know that this is something that I like riffing on, that people hear the first part, right? Let my people go, shalach et b'ni, right? Let my children go, let my sons go. But there's another part to it. It says, so that they may serve me. And all that people hear is, let my people go. They don't hear the part that says that they may serve me. They only hear half of it. And the fact that our freedom is to allow us to be free to serve our divine creator. And the truth is that, of course, the fact that we are free to make that decision is a source of great significance and joy and inspiration in our lives. At any rate, that's the sermon on that one. Vatima'en l'shalcho. And if you refuse to free him, hine, behold, or indeed, anochi, I, horeg, will kill, et bincha b'chorecha, your firstborn son. So, very serious threat that Moses is told to give Pharaoh. Imagine to yourselves for a second what courage that would take on Moses' part to say such a thing to the ruler of Egypt, right? So again, I don't know if there's a takeaway here in terms of the impersonal courage it takes for us to, in fact, do this. Now, let me do the Rashi, and then I'm going to give you sort of a more interpretive understanding of what we're reading here. So, if I can, right? Okay. Let's find it here. Omar elecha, and I say to you, B'shlichuto shel makom. Those words were being said at the behest of God. In other words, as God was sending him. Shalach et b'ni, free my son, my Hine, and he's interpolating this, Hine anochi horeg, and if you don't do that, I'm going to kill, etc. He maka achrona. This turns out, of course, to be the very last plague. Uva hitrehu tchila, right? But he forewarned him. That's hatara, right? He forewarned him tchila at the beginning. Mipnei, because shehi kasha, because this was so severe. Vezehu shinemar be'iyov, and this is referenced in the book of Job, Job chapter 36. Hein, let's see. Ein, I think this is El Yaskiv Bekocho, right? This is a Aramaism. Behold, God is extremely powerful, is great and mighty in power. Lefichach, for this reason, mi kamohu more. Who can compare to him as a teacher, right? Basar vadam, right? When it comes to mortals, flesh and blood, literally. Hamavakesh lihinakem mechavero, who chooses to avenge his fellow. Ma'alim et varav. So he doesn't tell him. He doesn't let him know ahead of time, right? He covers up his words. Shelo yivakesh hatzala, so that his friend doesn't seek help, aid. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but the Holy One, blessed be He, Yaskiv Bekocho, is so mighty in power, ve'en yacholet lihimalet miyado, that it is impossible to escape from his, literally from his hand, in other words, from his control. Ki im beshuvo elav. The only way you can do that is tshuva, repentance, only through returning to him. Lefichach, and for this reason, umorehu, he can teach him, umatrebo lashuv, and will forewarn him. In other words, he tries to tell him in advance in order to teach him the ways of repentance. And that's why we how we understand this. Okay. All right. Let me think. There was a Okay, so now, of course, I forgot the idea that I wanted to share with you before, sadly. And yeah, see if I, yeah. Bart, did you want to comment?
I did have a question.
Yes,
When you read the Hebrew translation, it sounded like Moses like was God and that he was speaking God's words.
yes. He
Like,
was
I am very upset with you. I'm going to kill your firstborn.
right. He says, "Thus says God." God is saying this to
Oh,
you.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Uh,
He was telling him, right? Gosh, I wish I could remember the point because there was a more. Okay, okay. I remembered now what I wanted to say. Thank you, Bart. It was through your assistance. Understand? All right. It's the way the mind works. I think this is also that this whole story about Israel and Egypt can also be understood as a personal journey within us. That we have, that Pharaoh is also our ego, our own ego, and that we are enslaved. We can become enslaved to our own personal needs. And in fact, the extreme of that is, of course, addiction. And that Pharaoh is, so to speak, and that slavery in Egypt, Pharaoh would represent the little voice inside of ourselves that allows us to become addicted. Because addictions don't just start as addictions, they are a process, they involve a process, and addictions are clearly enslavements. And this is, in fact, a story about rescuing ourselves from addictions, because so often we are, in fact, facing plagues, right? That those addictions clearly lead to very painful experiences and dreadful experiences. And ultimately, we know those addictions can wind up with a person losing their life. And the thing is this, if we recognize that our lives are really not our own, that we are in fact here purely through the grace of a greater power, and that we owe that power our appreciation and our loyalty, that in fact it is a way to free ourselves from the kinds of addictions in the world that we will experience. and that this is a great, great metaphor for that experience. And so Pharaoh, we can look at Pharaoh, we can take this purely on the pshat level, and sort of look at Pharaoh as another person, or we can understand Pharaoh as being that power within us that can enslave us. That's what I wanted to share with you. So let me stop here. I think it's a good place to stop, and I'll mark the verse. And right, let's see. Hold on a second. Right there. Right. We actually will be starting a very interesting passage that comes up, and in some ways, it's a puzzling passage. But I believe I have some sense of what this is dealing with philosophically, and so I'm going to stop the share here. And if any of you have any questions or comments before I go off record, feel free. Okay, going once. Yes, Bart, go for it. Just unmute. You're
Who?
still muted, you know that.
Okay.
Yes,
One thing I noticed is when you share your screen, there's a little drop down that says options. One is fit to window, and the other one is show original size. And
yes.
show original size is much bigger and easier to
Oh, that's
read.
interesting. Interesting. Yeah, so it depends on the size of your screen, right? So, you can adjust the size of it, I think, yourself, of the amount, that little sort of green rectangle in which it is. I think you can adjust that. So, but anyway, I'm glad you have a good fix. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just to the right where it says you're sharing, just to the right where it
Yes.
says
Right.
option. You click it
Right.
down and you
Got
get
it.
fit.
Good.
So
Well,
that I thought was worth sharing.
yes, for sure. David, you're off mute.
Yeah, so I had a question back earlier when you were talking about the firstborn, right?
Yes.
And the fact that, that the Jewish people, are considered God's firstborn. So
Yes.
but the question I have is, God chose only to take the firstborn son, the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. God didn't choose to take all the children, and God didn't choose, and God didn't choose to take all the sons, right? It's only the firstborn. So the question I have is, does that mean that, it's basically saying, okay, I'm now going to, replace, or you will no longer have the ability, to be treated in this world, that the Israelites, or the Jewish people are above you, because essentially now I've taken away your firstborn, and they're, and yeah, and they're big. I don't want to say replace, because that has bad connotations in our society, the whole replacement call anyway. But
Right.
anyway, it does sound like that, that yeah. So I'm just wondering why why, the point of limiting to the firstborn sons, what that really meant, or if there's
Right.
something beyond just, yeah, that's
Sure.
the question.
So if I'm understanding your question properly, and the way you mean it, my first initial response is saying that if you continue to enslave my firstborn, I'm going to take yours. It's quid pro quo. Okay, I mean that's at least the way I understand it right now. Um, Understanding what firstborn really is, while on the one hand it retains a certain privilege, right, that the firstborn gets a double portion of what all the other sons get. That's sort of how basically firstborn privilege works. But nevertheless, there are responsibilities that go along with it. And initially, the firstborn son would be a priest, would have the role of a priest. That is what we need to understand about the nature of firstborn. And so in serving God, and by the way, if you ask yourself, well, what does a priest have to do? What are the priest's responsibilities? So, it says, be disciples of Aaron. Aaron turned out, of course, to be the high priest and the priests. So, first of all, they have a minimum amount they don't have any property to speak of except these Levitical cities, right? They're Levites, so the Levites themselves only had cities. They did not have territory like the rest of the Israelites. But on the other hand, that is because God was their main responsibility. In other words, trying to lead the people in their relationship with the divine and with and with these spiritual things. So, that is the role of the Jewish people. That is, so we have some really profound statements here as to what it is, to be a member of the Jewish people. And I see it less as privileges and more as responsibilities. To practice laws of kindness, to practice, to follow the commandments, many of which have ethical bases to them, right? And to look at life in a very different way than perhaps many people do, and that it's trying to give us that guidance. David, I hope I'm answering your question, and maybe I'm not. So
No,
chip in.
yeah, no, you are. I think the question I have on that then, so does that mean, that it was quid pro quo, or does it also mean that, by taking the firstborn, God was essentially taking away, the Egyptians' ability, because you take away the priesthood, you've now taken away their identity, right? I mean, to some extent. I mean, is that also, part of it? I'm just
It
asking.
could be. No, no, no. I don't think I've ever looked at it the way you are, and I appreciate, the insight you're giving. So, um, maybe in some sense it's saying, and really and truly you can say that the plagues there were to try to show the Egyptians that their religion, their religious understanding was flawed. Okay. And that's part of what's going on here and how it relates to, say, the priests. I think on another level, ask yourself, we all at least have learned that Egypt at the time was perhaps one of the two preeminent civilizations at the time, right? The other one was Babylonia. And what it's saying maybe is that that preeminence has less value than what God is saying he wants to do with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Ah, yeah, that
So,
makes. Yep.
okay, so and I would not have come up with that, David, if you had not asked your question. So
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks. But
And yeah,
yeah, the themes are okay. So that's basically also promoting the religious devotion, right? Or
yes, absolutely,
over,
absolutely.
over the preeminence, or if you want to look at it,
Right.
the nature of, the Egyptians or the Babylonians at that time, right? It's
Right.
basically
Yes,
okay.
yes. I
So
think it is. I think it's doing that. Yeah.
interesting. Okay.
All right. So with that, I am going to stop the recording.